In the sterile waiting room of Millbrook Heights Medical Center, a 52-year-old widow was about to discover her daughter's devastating betrayal. What started as a routine doctor's appointment took a shocking turn when she overheard a calculated conspiracy. Sarah Williams wasn't your typical grieving mother. For 2 decades, she had served as a registered nurse known for her sharp medical instincts. When she secretly recorded Emma instructing Dr. Reed to tell her she's going crazy, she uncovered a web of medical gaslighting designed to steal her inheritance. What began as supposed family concern would become a fight against institutional corruption that would forever change Millbrook Heights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smoke alarm's shrill cry cut through the late afternoon silence like a knife through Sarah Williams' muddled thoughts. She stood frozen in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, her hand gripping the doorframe as the acrid smell of burning filled her nostrils. The skillet on the stove glowed cherry red. The chicken breast inside transformed into a blackened, smoking mass. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarm's relentless wail. Her legs felt unsteady as she rushed toward the stove, grabbing the pot holder with trembling fingers. The heat hit her face like a physical blow as she switched off the burner and moved the ruined pan to a cold burner. The smoke hung thick in the air, and Sarah's eyes watered, though whether from the acrid fumes or something deeper, she couldn't say. This was the third time this month. 3 times she'd started cooking and simply forgotten, lost in memories of James or staring out the window at nothing, her mind drifting like a boat without an anchor. The house felt too big now, too quiet, filled with echoes of conversations that would never happen again. Sarah opened the kitchen windows, waving a dish towel to clear the smoke. Her reflection caught in the glass. A 52-year-old woman who looked older, her auburn hair showing more silver than she remembered. Her green eyes dulled with an exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. James used to say those eyes could light up a room. Now they struggled to light up her own face. 6 months. 6 months since the heart attack had taken him while she was at her book club discussing some romance novel she couldn't even remember now. 6 months since she'd come home to find him collapsed in his study, still wearing the reading glasses she'd bought him for their 25th anniversary. The paramedics said he'd been gone for hours. The smoke alarm finally fell silent, but the memory of its cry seemed to echo in her bones. Sarah sank into one of the kitchen chairs, James's chair, though she'd never admit that aloud, and buried her face in her hands. The fatigue hit her again, that bone-deep exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Her doctor called it grief. Her late nights called it something else entirely. The doorbell chimed through the house, cutting through her spiral of self-pity. Sarah glanced at the clock on the microwave. 4:30 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone, but then again, she rarely expected anything these days. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. "Coming," she called, though her voice cracked slightly on the word. Through the front door's glass panel, she could see a familiar silhouette, tall, elegant, with perfectly styled blonde hair that caught the afternoon light. Sarah's heart did something complicated, a mixture of relief and weariness that she couldn't quite name. Emma stood on the doorstep with 2 large suitcases and an expression of carefully constructed concern. At 28, she was everything Sarah had once been, confident, beautiful, with that particular brand of charm that could open doors and hearts with equal ease. But there was something in her daughter's blue eyes, something that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of James' warnings from months past. "Mom." Emma's voice carried just the right note of gentle worry. "I could smell the smoke from the driveway. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically, then caught herself. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for 6 months, and they both knew it. Just burnt dinner again. Emma stepped forward, enveloping Sarah in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and something else, something that reminded Sarah of desperation, though she couldn't place why. Her daughter had always been good at hugs, at knowing exactly how long to hold on and when to pull away for maximum emotional impact. "I'm so glad I decided to come," Emma said, stepping back to study Sarah's face with an intensity that felt almost clinical. "You look tired, Mom. Really tired. What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, though she was already stepping aside to let Emma in. "I thought you were dealing with the divorce proceedings." Emma's face crumpled slightly, perfectly. Sarah noticed with the small part of her mind that remained a nurse after all these years. The expression wasn't quite right, too practiced, like an actor who'd rehearsed the scene too many times. "It's finalized," Emma said, her voice catching. "David got everything. The house, the cars, even the vacation home in the Hamptons. His lawyers were better than mine," she trailed off, looking down at her hands. "I have nowhere else to go, Mom. I need to come home just for a while until I get back on my feet." Sarah felt her heart contract. Whatever her concerns about Emma and James's old warnings, her daughter was hurting. And this house, this empty, echoing house, could certainly use some life in it. "Of course," Sarah said, surprising herself with how quickly the words came. "Of course you can stay. Your room is exactly how you left it." Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her face completely. "Thank you, Mom. I promise I won't be any trouble. Actually, I want to help. I've been so worried about you since Dad died, especially living alone out here." Something in the way Emma said, "worried," made Sarah's chest tighten. It was the same tone the neighbors used now when they saw her at the grocery store. That careful, pitying inflection suggested she was something fragile that might break at any moment. "I've been managing fine," Sarah said, though even she could hear the defensiveness in her voice. "I'm sure you have," Emma said quickly. "Too quickly. It's just, well, the smoke alarm, and you said this has happened before. I just think it might be good for you to have someone around, someone who can keep an eye on things." Keep an eye on things. The phrase sat strangely in Sarah's mind as she helped Emma carry her bags upstairs. When had she become something that needed watching? When had her life become something that required supervision? Emma's old room welcomed them with the smell of lavender sachets and dust. Everything was exactly as she'd left it when she married David 3 years ago. The white furniture she'd picked out in high school, the collection of horse figurines on the dresser, the bulletin board still covered with photos of friends whose names Sarah could barely remember. "It's perfect," Emma said, setting her suitcase on the bed. "Just like coming home." But as Sarah watched her daughter unpack, she noticed Emma's attention kept drifting. To the window that overlooked the backyard, to the hallway that led to James's study, to the small safe in the corner where Sarah kept important documents. It was probably nothing, just Emma taking in the familiar spaces of her childhood. But something about it made Sarah's nursing instincts prickle with unease. "Mom," Emma said suddenly, pulling out a small leather notebook. "I hope you don't mind, but I've been keeping track of some things. Just little observations about your health and, well, your state of mind. I know it sounds clinical, but I want to make sure you're getting the help you need." Sarah stared at the notebook. What kind of observations? Emma flipped it open, and Sarah could see pages of neat handwriting, dates, times, detailed notes. "Well, like today with the stove. And Mrs. Peterson mentioned you seemed confused when she saw you at the post office last week. And Michael said when he called 2 weeks ago, you sounded disoriented, like you didn't remember he was supposed to call." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She did remember being confused at the post office. She'd forgotten what she'd come for and stood in line for 10 minutes before remembering she needed stamps. And Michael's call. There had been something off about that conversation, though she'd attributed it to her grief. "You've been talking to the neighbors about me?" Sarah asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "Not talking exactly," Emma said, her tone gentle but firm. "But people are concerned, Mom. And I think maybe we should consider having you see someone, a professional, just to make sure everything's okay." The suggestion landed in the quiet room like a stone in still water, creating ripples that Sarah couldn't quite grasp. Part of her was grateful. Emma was here, wanting to help, wanting to take care of her. But another part, a part that sounded suspiciously like James's voice, whispered warnings she couldn't quite understand. "I don't need a doctor," Sarah said.
I'm grieving.
"It's normal to be scattered." Emma moved closer, her expression soft with concern. Of course, it's normal, Mom, but forgetting to turn off the stove, getting confused about simple things. These could be signs of something more serious, something treatable. Wouldn't Dad want you to take care of yourself? The mention of James sent a sharp pang through Sarah's chest. She could almost hear his voice, though the memory was frustratingly unclear. Something about Emma. Something he'd tried to tell her before the heart attack. But the harder she tried to remember, the more the memory slipped away, like smoke through her fingers. Maybe, Sarah said finally. Maybe you're right. Emma's smile was brilliant, and she pulled out her phone immediately. I'll call Dr. Reed's office first thing tomorrow. He's known you forever. He'll be able to tell if there's anything to worry about. As Emma scrolled through her contacts, Sarah caught a glimpse of something in her daughter's expression. A flash of satisfaction that seemed oddly out of place. It was gone so quickly that Sarah wondered if she'd imagined it. Another symptom of the confusion that seemed to be plaguing her lately. That night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to Emma moving around in the room down the hall, she tried to remember what James had been trying to tell her about their daughter. But the memory remained stubbornly elusive, buried under layers of grief and the growing fear that maybe Emma was right. Maybe there was something wrong with her mind, something beyond normal grief. Outside her window, the autumn wind rattled the trees James had planted when they'd first moved to Millbrook Heights. The sound used to comfort her. Now it only emphasized how alone she felt, even with Emma sleeping just down the hall. Especially with Emma sleeping just down the hall. Tomorrow she would see Dr. Reed. Tomorrow she would find out if the fears growing in the dark corners of her mind were justified, or if they were just another symptom of a grief so profound it was reshaping her very thoughts. Tonight she would lie awake and wonder why Emma's concern felt less like love and more like something else entirely. Something that made her want to hide James' warnings even from herself. The house settled around them with its familiar nighttime creaks and sighs. But for the first time since James's death, Sarah didn't feel comforted by the familiar sounds. Instead, she felt watched, cataloged, documented in Emma's careful notebook. And somewhere in the darkness, she could swear she heard the echo of James's voice, urgent and warning, trying to tell her something she desperately needed to remember. Marcus Reed's hand trembled slightly as he reached for Sarah Williams' medical file, though he told himself it was merely caffeine withdrawal from skipping his morning coffee. The gambling debts that kept him awake most nights had nothing to do with a slight shake in his fingers or the way his stomach clenched when Emma Williams Morrison had called yesterday to discuss her mother's concerning symptoms. The appointment was scheduled for 10:30 a.m., and Marcus had arrived at his office early, ostensibly to review patient files, but really to steel himself for what Emma had described as an intervention of sorts. Her voice had carried that particular blend of concern and authority that reminded him uncomfortably of his ex-wife's tone. Through his office window, Marcus watched the Williams women approach the medical building. Emma walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being heard, while Sarah moved more carefully, as if testing each step. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the exhaustion in Sarah's posture, the slight forward lean of someone carrying invisible weight. He'd known Sarah Williams for 8 years, ever since she'd first brought Emma to him for a persistent cough that turned out to be nothing more than seasonal allergies. Back then, Sarah had been vibrant and sharp, asking the right questions with the precision of someone who understood medical terminology. She'd been a nurse once, he remembered, before marriage and motherhood had redirected her path. That woman seemed like a stranger compared to the person who entered his examination room 15 minutes later. "Good morning, Sarah," Marcus said, forcing warmth into his voice as he gestured toward the examination table. Emma mentioned, "You've been having some concerns." Sarah's green eyes, once bright with intelligence, now seemed clouded with uncertainty. She glanced at Emma before answering, a gesture that struck Marcus as oddly childlike. "I've been scattered lately, since James died." "Of course," Marcus nodded, making a note on his pad. "Grief can manifest in many ways." "Emma, why don't you tell me what you've observed?" Emma stepped forward with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to taking charge. From her purse, she withdrew a leather-bound notebook that looked expensive. "Professional. I've been documenting Mom's symptoms since I moved back home last week. I hope you don't mind. I know it might seem clinical, but I wanted to give you a complete picture. She opened the notebook with a flourish, revealing pages of neat handwriting organized by date and time. Marcus found himself impressed despite his unease. This was the kind of thorough documentation he rarely saw from family members. October 15th, 4:30 p.m., Emma read aloud. Mom left the stove on with chicken burning. Smoke alarm activated. She seemed genuinely surprised, as if she'd forgotten she was cooking entirely. She looked up at Marcus with perfectly calculated concern. This is the third incident like this in 2 weeks. Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the examination table. I've been tired. It's normal to be forgetful when you're grieving. Of course it is, Emma agreed quickly, her tone gentle but firm. But there are other things, Mom. Remember when you got lost driving to the grocery store last week? You've been shopping at that same store for 15 years. Marcus watched Sarah's face crumple slightly. He could see her trying to remember, the effort visible in the way her brow furrowed. Yes, I took a wrong turn, but I found my way eventually, she said. After calling me in tears, Emma added softly. You were so confused, Mom. So scared. The shame in Sarah's expression was painful to witness. Marcus had seen this before in elderly patients, the gradual erosion of confidence that came with cognitive decline. But Sarah was only 52, far too young for typical dementia. Still, early onset cases weren't unheard of, and trauma could accelerate existing conditions. Let's start with some basic assessments, Marcus said, pulling out his standard cognitive evaluation tools. Sarah, can you tell me what year it is? 2024, Sarah answered without hesitation. And who's the current president? Sarah's response was immediate and accurate. Marcus continued through the standard questions: date, location, simple memory tasks. To his surprise, Sarah passed each one easily, her nursing background evident in the way she anticipated some of his tests. But Emma wasn't finished. As Marcus made notes, she continued reading from her journal. October 12th, evening, Mom called me 3 times, asking if I'd heard from Michael, forgetting each previous conversation. October 14th morning, found Mom standing in Dad's study, talking to herself. When I asked what she was doing, she seemed genuinely confused about why she was there. Marcus noticed how Sarah's confidence seemed to deflate with each entry. The woman who had answered his questions sharply just minutes before now looked small and uncertain. I don't remember calling you 3 times, Sarah said quietly. I know, Mom, Emma replied with infinite patience. That's what worries me. Marcus set down his pen, studying both women. Something felt off about the dynamic, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Emma's concern seemed genuine, her documentation thorough, but there was something almost theatrical about her presentation, as if she were performing the role of worried daughter rather than living it. Sarah, he said, how have you been sleeping? Poorly, she admitted. I keep having dreams about James. Sometimes I wake up expecting him to be there. That's completely normal for someone processing grief, Marcus assured her. What about your appetite, energy levels? Everything tastes like cardboard, Sarah said. And I'm tired all the time. So tired that some days I can barely get out of bed. Emma leaned forward. Dr. Reed, I'm wondering if we should consider that this might be more than grief. Mom's symptoms seem to be getting worse, not better. The confusion, the memory problems, the way she sometimes just stares into space for minutes at a time. Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Emma's implication was clear, and he knew what she was asking him to consider. The question was whether his assessment would be based on medical evidence or the mounting pressure of his own financial desperation. I'd like to prescribe something mild for anxiety, he said carefully. Grief and anxiety often present with similar symptoms: confusion, memory problems, difficulty concentrating. The medication might help clear some of the fog. He wrote out a prescription for low-dose lorazepam, his hands steady now that he'd made a decision. Start with half a tablet at bedtime. We'll monitor how you respond. Emma accepted the prescription with a grateful smile. Thank you, Dr. Reed. I'll make sure Mom takes it exactly as prescribed. And I think it would be good to schedule regular check-ins, don't you? To monitor her progress. Weekly visits might be helpful initially, Marcus agreed, though something about Emma's eagerness to manage her mother's medication made him uncomfortable. Sarah, how do you feel about that arrangement? Sarah looked between them, and Marcus caught something in her expression, a flash of the sharp intelligence he remembered from years past. For just a moment, she looked like the competent woman who used to challenge his diagnosis and ask probing questions about treatment plans. I can manage my own medication, she said quietly but firmly. Of course you can, Mom, Emma said quickly. I just meant I could help remind you, since you've been having trouble with memory lately. Just until you're feeling better. The way Emma phrased it, gentle, reasonable, loving, made any objections sound unreasonable. Marcus watched Sarah's brief moment of assertion crumble under her daughter's carefully applied pressure. I suppose that would be helpful, Sarah conceded. As they prepared to leave, Emma lingered at Marcus' desk. Doctor, may I speak with you privately for just a moment about Mom's care? Sarah was already at the door, studying a poster about heart disease with the focused attention of someone trying not to appear as lost as she felt. Marcus nodded, though every instinct told him this conversation would cross lines he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. I'm worried about her living alone, Emma said in a low voice. These incidents are escalating, and I'm not always there to prevent them if she burns the house down or gets lost driving. I know you can't make someone accept help, but if her condition continues to deteriorate, what options do we have? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Marcus wasn't ready to face. He thought about his mounting debts, about the casino's increasingly frequent phone calls, about Emma's offer last month to help with his temporary financial difficulties in exchange for keeping a closer eye on her mother's health. Let's see how she responds to the medication first, he said finally. Sometimes treating the anxiety can resolve many of the cognitive symptoms. Emma nodded, but something in her eyes suggested she'd already moved beyond hope for simple solutions. Of course, but if the medication doesn't help, if she continues to decline, there are facilities, aren't there? Places where she could get proper care? The word facilities sent a chill through Marcus. He'd seen what happened to patients once families started exploring institutional care. The process was often irreversible, especially when backed by medical documentation of cognitive decline. We're not there yet, he said firmly. Sarah is grieving, not demented. There is a significant difference. But if we were there, Emma pressed gently, hypothetically speaking, what would that process look like? Marcus found himself explaining competency evaluations, court procedures, and the various levels of care available for patients with diminished capacity. Even as he spoke, he felt sick with himself. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. By the time they finished talking, Sarah had moved from the heart disease poster to one about depression. She stood with her back to them, but Marcus caught her reflection in the glass covering the poster. She wasn't reading about depression symptoms. She was watching them, her expression sharp with suspicion. How much had she heard? How much did she understand about the conversation that had just taken place about her future? Ready, Mom? Emma called cheerfully, as if they'd been discussing nothing more significant than the weather. Sarah turned, and the suspicious intelligence Marcus had glimpsed was gone, replaced by the confused uncertainty that seemed to be her default state lately. Ready, she said simply. As they left, Marcus heard Emma's voice in the hallway, warm and caring as she discussed lunch plans with her mother. To anyone listening, she sounded like the perfect devoted daughter. But Marcus couldn't shake the image of Sarah's reflection in that poster glass. Alert, aware, and deeply afraid. He spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on other patients, but his thoughts kept returning to the Williams women. Something about their dynamic troubled him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Emma's documentation was thorough, her concerns reasonable, her devotion apparent. So why did he feel like he'd just participated in something that would keep him awake tonight, adding to the guilt that already competed with his financial anxieties? By lunchtime, Marcus had convinced himself he was overthinking the situation. Grief could indeed mimic cognitive decline. Emma was understandably worried about her recently widowed mother. The medication might genuinely help clear Sarah's confusion. These were all reasonable, defensible medical decisions. She was becoming a case study in her own daughter's notebook, reduced to symptoms and concerning behaviors. After breakfast, Emma announced she needed to run errands, grocery shopping, she said, and a stop at the pharmacy to refill Sarah's medication. "Will you be okay alone for a couple of hours?" The question itself felt loaded. 6 months ago, no one would have asked if Sarah could manage a few hours alone in her own home. Now, it seemed like a reasonable concern, another entry for Emma's careful documentation. "I'll be fine," Sarah said, though even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Emma hesitated at the door. "Maybe I should call Mrs. Peterson. Ask her to check on you."
No.
The word came out more sharply than Sarah intended. "I don't need a babysitter." "Of course not." Emma backtracked quickly. "I just worry. You understand, don't you? After everything that's happened." She left the sentence hanging. But Sarah understood the implication after the stove incidents, after getting lost driving to the grocery store, after all the documented evidence of her declining competence. Once Emma's car disappeared around the corner, Sarah felt something shift in her chest. A loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The house felt different without Emma's watchful presence, quieter, but somehow more like home. She decided to make tea, taking extra care with each step. Fill the kettle. Check that the stove is on the correct setting. Set a timer. She would not give Emma another incident to document. While waiting for the water to boil, Sarah found herself drawn to James's study. The room had been sealed off from her grief for months. But today, something pulled her toward it. Maybe it was the medication wearing off. Or maybe it was the strange clarity that came from being alone in her own house. James's computer sat on his desk exactly where he'd left it. The screen dark but somehow expectant. Sarah had avoided it since his death, unable to face the digital remnants of his life. But now, with Emma's notebook entries fresh in her mind, she felt compelled to look for something, though she wasn't sure what. The computer required a password. Sarah tried their anniversary date, then James's birthday, then her own. Nothing. She was about to give up when she remembered something James used to say about passwords. They should be memorable, but not obvious. She tried the name of their first dog, combined with the year they bought this house. The screen came to life. James's desktop was organized with the same methodical precision he'd brought to everything else in his life. Files sorted by year and purpose, emails archived, documents labeled with careful specificity. Sarah opened his document folder, not sure what she was looking for. That's when she saw it. A folder labeled Emma Financial Concerns. Her heart began beating faster as she clicked it open. Inside were bank statements, credit reports, and what appeared to be a private investigator's preliminary report dated just 2 weeks before James's death. The investigator's name was Robert Chen, and his letterhead indicated specialization in financial fraud and domestic investigations. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the first document. It was a bank statement for an account she didn't recognize, but Emma's name was listed as the primary account holder. The balance showed a pattern of increasingly desperate financial activity: large cash withdrawals, overdraft fees, transfers from multiple credit lines. The next document was worse. A detailed report of Emma's gambling debts accumulated during her marriage to David. $50,000 owed to various creditors, including some with names that made Sarah's stomach clench with recognition. She'd seen enough police reports during her nursing career to know the difference between legitimate businesses and loan sharks. But the most damning document was a handwritten note in James's familiar scrawl. "Emma has been accessing my business accounts. Found evidence of forged signatures on 3 separate transactions. She's in deeper trouble than she's admitting. Need to confront her about Mom's inheritance." The inheritance. Sarah had barely thought about it since James's death, too consumed with grief to focus on practical matters. But James had been meticulous about financial planning, and she knew he'd left her well provided for. The life insurance alone was substantial, not to mention his business assets and their savings. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, but Emma had left for errands. Sarah had watched her drive away. "Mom," Emma's voice called from the front hallway. "I forgot my grocery list." "Where did you put it?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Emma was back, And here she sat in James's study with evidence of her daughter's financial desperation spread across the computer screen. She quickly minimized the windows, but the damage was done. If Emma came looking for her, the questions would be inevitable. "Just a minute," Sarah called back, trying to keep her voice steady. She closed the financial documents and opened James's email instead, hoping it would look more innocent if Emma found her there. That's when she saw them. Emails from the private investigator dated just days before James's death. The most recent one made her blood run cold. "Mr. Williams, based on our phone conversation, I understand you're concerned about your daughter's intentions regarding your wife's well-being. The financial pressure she's under makes people desperate. I recommend we schedule a meeting to discuss protective measures for Mrs. Williams as soon as possible, given the medical power of attorney documents Emma has been researching. Time may be of the essence." Medical power of attorney. Sarah's nursing background kicked in with crystal clarity. She knew exactly what that meant and why Emma would be researching it. Someone would need to declare her mentally incompetent first. "Mom, where are you?" Emma's voice was closer now, moving through the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Sarah quickly printed the investigator's email, her hands shaking as she folded it and slipped it into her pocket. She closed the computer and tried to compose herself, but her mind was racing with implications she didn't want to believe. Emma appeared in the study doorway, her expression shifting from casual to concerned as she took in the scene. "What are you doing in here, Mom?" "I was just," Sarah's voice caught. "I missed him. I wanted to feel close to him." Emma's face softened, but there was something calculating behind her eyes. "Oh, Mom. Of course you did. But you know how hard it is for you to be in here. Remember what happened last time? You got so confused talking to Dad, as if he were still here." Sarah didn't remember that conversation, but then again, she didn't trust her memory anymore. The medication, the stress, the grief, it all blurred together into an unreliable narrative of her own life. "Come on," Emma said gently, taking Sarah's arm. "Let's get you some tea, and I think it's time for your afternoon dose." As Emma guided her from the study, Sarah felt the printed email crinkle in her pocket, physical evidence of James' concerns, of Emma's research into medical power of attorney, of the dangerous financial pressure her daughter was under. But what could she do with it? Who would believe her? Emma's documentation was thorough, professional, backed by medical authority. Sarah's suspicions would sound like paranoid delusions, especially given her recent symptoms of confusion and memory loss. That evening, as Emma prepared dinner with the same elaborate care she'd shown at breakfast, Sarah sat at the kitchen table pretending to read a magazine while her mind raced. The printed email felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, evidence of a conspiracy she was only beginning to understand. Emma chatted cheerfully about her errands. The grocery store had been crowded. The pharmacy had been slow. She'd run into Mrs. Peterson, who'd asked about Sarah's health with the kind of concerned nosiness that small communities specialized in. "She mentioned that you seemed confused the other day," Emma said casually, not looking up from her chopping. But as he sat in his office eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard, Marcus couldn't escape the memory of Sarah's face and that poster's reflection, intelligent, suspicious, and utterly alone despite her daughter's devoted presence beside her. The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine appointments, but Marcus found his concentration fractured. Between patients, he caught himself staring out his window toward the Williams house, visible in the distance among the manicured lawns of Millbrook Heights. Somewhere in that house, Sarah was probably taking her first dose of anxiety medication, trusting that it would help lift the fog that had descended over her life since her husband's death. Marcus hoped he was right about the medication. He hoped Emma's concerns were born of love rather than something else entirely. Most of all, he hoped that the growing knot in his stomach was just stress about his gambling debts and not intuition about a situation spinning beyond his control. But as the sun set over the affluent suburb, casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained yards, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just taken the first step down a path that would be very difficult to retrace. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Sarah Williams was about to discover exactly how vulnerable she'd become in the hands of those who claimed to love her most. The medication made everything feel wrapped in cotton. Sarah sat at her kitchen table 3 days after the doctor's visit, staring at the half-dissolved tablet in her palm. The lorazepam was supposed to help with her anxiety, but instead, it seemed to muffle the world around her, making her thoughts move like honey through a strainer. Emma bustled around the kitchen preparing what she called a proper breakfast: eggs Benedict with fresh hollandaise, the kind of elaborate meal that required constant attention. It was the sort of cooking Sarah used to do when the children were young, when she had energy for such things. Now, watching Emma's efficient movements felt like observing someone through thick glass. "You need to take your medicine, Mom," Emma said without looking up from the stovetop. Dr. Reed was very specific about the timing. Sarah rolled the tablet between her fingers. "It makes me feel disconnected, like I'm floating." "That's just the anxiety leaving your system," Emma replied smoothly. Dr. Reed said that's completely normal. Your body needs time to adjust. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But Sarah's body had adjusted to medications before, back when she was nursing. She knew the difference between therapeutic sedation and chemical fog. This felt more like the latter, a deliberate dimming of her sharpest edges, the ones that might ask inconvenient questions or notice inconsistencies. She palmed the tablet instead of swallowing it, a small act of rebellion that made her feel slightly more like herself. Emma didn't notice, too focused on plating the eggs with restaurant precision. "I've been thinking," Emma said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "Maybe we should have Michael come visit. He's been so worried about you since Dad died, and I think seeing you like this would help him understand why we need to be more proactive about your care." The word proactive sent an uncomfortable chill through Sarah's chest. "Like this? What do you mean, like this?" Emma's expression softened into practiced concern. "Oh, Mom, you just seem so fragile lately, so confused. Yesterday, you asked me 3 times when Dad's birthday is, and this morning you put salt in your coffee instead of sugar." Sarah tried to remember putting salt in her coffee. The memory felt slippery, uncertain. Had she done that? The medication made everything feel unreliable, including her own recollections. "I don't remember." "That's exactly what I mean," Emma interrupted gently. "The memory issues are getting worse. I've been documenting everything for Dr. Reed, and the pattern is concerning." She pulled out her leather notebook again, flipping to a page covered in neat handwriting. Sarah caught glimpses of entries, confusion about dates, forgetting conversations within minutes, found staring blankly at the wall for an extended period. "When did you write all this?" Sarah asked, studying the detailed entries. "I've been keeping careful notes since I got here," Emma said. "I know it might seem clinical, but I want to make sure Dr. Reed has a complete picture. Someone needs to advocate for you, Mom. Someone needs to make sure you get the help you need." The word, advocate, should have felt comforting. Instead, it made Sarah think of the way nurses talked about patients who couldn't speak for themselves. Said you couldn't remember why you'd gone to the post office.
"She's worried about you, Mom."
Everyone is. The net was tightening. Sarah could feel it in the way Emma documented every stumble, every moment of uncertainty. In the way Dr. Reed had looked at her during the appointment, not like a competent woman going through grief, but like a patient whose capacity was in question. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "what exactly did you discuss with Dr. Reed when I wasn't listening?" Emma's knife paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming its steady rhythm. "Nothing concerning, Mom. Just your care plan, making sure you get the support you need." "What kind of support?" "Well, if the medication doesn't help with your confusion and memory problems, there are other options. Places where you could get more intensive help, just temporarily, of course, until you're feeling better." Places. The word echoed James's investigator's warning about time being of the essence. If Emma could prove Sarah was mentally incompetent, she could gain control over everything. The house, the inheritance, the life insurance, all of it. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah retrieved the printed email from her pocket and read it again by the dim light of her bedside lamp. James had known. He'd seen this coming and had been trying to protect her. But his heart attack had cut short whatever plan he'd been developing. Now she was alone with evidence of Emma's desperation and no idea who to trust with the truth. The medication made her thoughts fuzzy, her memories unreliable. Emma's documentation painted her as increasingly incompetent. And somewhere in this web of medical manipulation and family betrayal, Sarah was drowning. But she still had her nursing instincts, dulled but not destroyed by grief and medication. And those instincts told her that James's death might not have been the random tragedy everyone believed it was. The timing was too convenient, his warnings too prescient, Emma's financial desperation too urgent. As Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to Emma's movements in the room down the hall, she made a decision. She would stop taking the medication that clouded her thoughts. She would start keeping her own documentation, her own careful record of Emma's behavior and inconsistencies. And she would find a way to honor James's final warning, even if it meant confronting the possibility that her own daughter might be willing to destroy her to save herself. The house settled around them with its familiar creaks and sighs. But Sarah no longer found comfort in the familiar sounds. Instead, she heard the whisper of pages turning in Emma's notebook, documenting another day of her decline. Tomorrow would bring new symptoms to record, new evidence of her diminishing capacity. But tomorrow, Sarah would be watching too. And for the first time since James's death, she had something more powerful than grief driving her. The terrible crystallizing certainty that her life depended on staying one step ahead of her daughter's carefully constructed lies. The third sleepless night brought clarity with the dawn. Sarah sat in James's study at 5:47 a.m. The house silent except for the hum of the computer and Emma's soft breathing from upstairs. She'd been awake since 3 a.m., her mind sharp for the first time in weeks. The lorazepam was completely out of her system now that she'd been palming the pills for 3 days. The password screen glowed before her, and this time she tried something different. Not their anniversary or birthdays, but something more personal. The coordinates of their honeymoon cabin in the Adirondacks, where James had promised they'd grow old together. The screen unlocked immediately. James' email history stretched back months, but Sarah focused on the weeks before his death. What she found made her stomach clench with a mixture of vindication and horror. Email after email with Robert Chin, the private investigator, documented Emma's increasingly desperate financial situation and her research into medical power of attorney procedures. One email, dated just 5 days before James' heart attack, contained an attachment labeled Financial Forensics Final Report. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. The document was thorough, devastating, and terrifying. Emma hadn't just been accessing James' business accounts, she'd been systematically draining them for months. Forged signatures on withdrawal slips, unauthorized transfers to cover gambling debts, even fake invoices for services never rendered. The total amount stolen was over $200,000, but the most chilling section was titled Medical Intervention Research. Chun had documented Emma's internet searches and library records. She'd been researching Alzheimer's symptoms, early onset dementia, and the legal procedures for declaring someone mentally incompetent. The investigators' notes were clinical but ominous. Subject has been studying methods for inducing confusion and memory loss in elderly individuals. Prescription drug interactions appear to be a particular area of interest, along with gaslighting techniques and institutional support for competency challenges. Recommend immediate legal consultation regarding protective measures for Mrs. Williams. Sarah's breath caught. Emma hadn't just been documenting her symptoms, she'd been creating them. The memory lapses, the confusion, the disorientation that made everyone so concerned about her mental state. She scrolled further, finding a video file labeled for Sarah, emergency only. Her hand hesitated over the mouse, knowing that whatever James had recorded would change everything irrevocably. His face filled the screen, thinner than she remembered, with lines of stress she'd been too grief-stricken to notice in those final weeks. He looked directly into the camera with the focused intensity she'd seen when he was worried about business problems. "Sarah, if you're watching this, then something has happened to me and you're in danger." His voice was steady but urgent. "Emma is not the daughter we raised. I don't know when she changed or why, but the woman living in our house is capable of things that would have been unthinkable to us 6 months ago." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I've hired Robertson to investigate her financial situation, and what we found terrifies me. She owes money to people who don't accept late payments gracefully. More importantly, she's been researching how to have you declared mentally incompetent. The medical power of attorney forms, the guardianship procedures. She's planning to take control of everything. James leaned closer to the camera, his expression desperate. I've seen the way she looks at you now, Sarah. Not like a daughter looking at her mother, but like someone calculating an investment. She's been putting something in your food. I think some kind of medication that makes you confused and forgetful. I've started monitoring her purchases, and she's been buying things that don't make sense. Supplements that shouldn't be mixed with your grief counseling medications, herbs that can cause memory problems in certain combinations. The room around Sarah seemed to spin. The meals Emma had been preparing with such elaborate care, the way she insisted on managing Sarah's medications, the concerned documentation of every moment of confusion, it had all been orchestrated. I was going to confront her today, James continued. Chun and I have enough evidence to force her to stop, maybe even to press charges, but I want you to know in case something happens to me that none of this is your fault. You're not losing your mind. You're being systematically poisoned and manipulated by someone who sees you as an obstacle to financial security. The video quality wavered slightly, and James looked off camera as if he'd heard something. When he looked back, his expression was urgent. If you're watching this, contact Detective Rosa Martinez immediately. I've already spoken with her about elder abuse cases, and she's expecting to hear from you if something happens to me. Don't trust anyone else. Not Dr. Reed, not the neighbors, and especially not Emma. She's gotten very good at playing the concerned daughter. The video ended abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at the black screen with tears streaming down her face. James had known. He'd been trying to protect her, and now he was gone, conveniently, permanently gone, just when Emma needed him out of the way. She quickly copied the video file to a thumb drive she found in James' desk drawer, along with all of Chen's reports and the damaging financial documents. As she worked, her mind raced through the implications. If James was right about the poisoning, then every moment of confusion, every memory lapse that had made her doubt her own sanity had been deliberately induced. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Emma's alarm clock, the same cheerful chime she'd been using since high school. Sarah had maybe 10 minutes before Emma came downstairs to start her morning routine of concerned caretaking and careful documentation. She closed all the files and shut down the computer, but kept the thumb drive clutched in her palm. Physical evidence of Emma's betrayal, James's warnings, and the investigators' findings. But what could she do with it? Emma's footsteps creaked overhead, moving toward the bathroom. Sarah slipped out of the study and back to her own room, sliding the thumb drive into the small jewelry box where she kept her wedding rings, hidden in plain sight, just another piece of her past life that Emma wouldn't think to examine. 15 minutes later, Emma knocked softly on her door. "Mom, how are you feeling this morning? You look a little pale." Sarah looked up from her bed, where she'd been pretending to read. Emma stood in the doorway wearing silk pajamas and an expression of practiced concern, holding a breakfast tray with elaborate care. "I brought you something special," Emma said, setting the tray on Sarah's nightstand. "Scrambled eggs with those herbs you used to love and fresh orange juice. You need to keep your strength up, especially with your medication adjustments." The eggs were perfectly prepared, garnished with what looked like fresh chives and something else Sarah couldn't identify. The orange juice had been poured into her favorite glass, the one James had given her for their anniversary years ago. Everything looked loving and thoughtful. Everything looked like poison. "That's very sweet of you," Sarah said carefully. "But I'm not really hungry this morning." Emma's expression shifted slightly, a flash of something that might have been frustration before the concern reasserted itself. "Mom, you need to eat. Dr. Reed was very specific about maintaining regular meals with your medication. Skipping breakfast could make your confusion worse." The way Emma said confusion made Sarah's skin crawl, as if it were an established fact, a medical diagnosis rather than a deliberately induced symptom. "Maybe later," Sarah said. "I think I'd like to get some fresh air first. Maybe take a walk around the neighborhood." A walk. Emma's voice carried a note of alarm. Mom, remember what happened last time you went out alone? You got lost coming back from the mailbox. Mrs. Peterson had to help you find the house. Sarah didn't remember getting lost at the mailbox, but then again, she was beginning to understand that her memories had been systematically compromised. How many of her symptoms were real, and how many were stories Emma had constructed to support her narrative of decline. "I'll be careful," Sarah said. "Maybe I'll just sit on the front porch." "Let me come with you," Emma said quickly. "I was going to call Dr. Reed anyway, update him on how you're responding to the medication. He's been so concerned about your episodes." Episodes. Another clinical term that reduced Sarah's life to a series of medical problems requiring intervention. "Actually," Sarah said, inspiration striking. "I think I'd like to call him myself today. Thank him for his help." Emma's expression went very still. "That's not necessary, Mom. I can handle all the medical communications. You shouldn't worry about those details." But Sarah was already reaching for her phone, and for the first time in weeks, her mind felt sharp enough to recognize the danger in Emma's eagerness to control every aspect of her medical care. The thumb drive in her jewelry box contained evidence that could expose everything. Emma's financial desperation, her research into competency procedures, her systematic manipulation of Sarah's health and mental state. But Sarah would need to be very careful about how she used that evidence because now she understood that Emma wasn't just trying to steal her inheritance. She was trying to erase Sarah entirely, to reduce her to a collection of symptoms and medical problems that required institutional management. And she was very, very good at it. The breakfast tray sat untouched on the nightstand, its carefully prepared contents growing cold. Sarah looked at her daughter's perfectly concerned expression and felt something she'd never expected to feel toward Emma: genuine fear. The war for her sanity and her life had begun. And Sarah was finally awake enough to fight back. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Sarah sat in the hard plastic chair, clutching the thumb drive in her sweaty palm. Officer Bradley Hawkins looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, his eyes occasionally drifting to his computer screen while she tried to explain why she needed to file a report against her own daughter. "So, let me get this straight, Mrs. Williams," Officer Hawkins said, his voice carrying the particular brand of patience reserved for difficult elderly citizens. "You believe your daughter is poisoning you to steal your inheritance?" "Not poisoning exactly," Sarah said, hating how her voice sounded, uncertain, desperate, exactly like someone experiencing paranoid delusions. "She's been giving me substances that interact with my prescribed medication, causing confusion and memory problems to make me appear mentally incompetent." Officer Hawkins glanced at the paperwork in front of him, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what he was reading: a medical report signed by Dr. Marcus Reed detailing her recent symptoms and medication adjustments. Emma had been busy. "Ma'am, I have to ask, are you currently taking medication for anxiety and depression?" The question felt like a trap. "Yes, and you've been experiencing memory problems, confusion, episodes where you've gotten lost or forgotten basic tasks." Each word was another nail in the coffin of her credibility. "Those symptoms were induced by Mrs. Williams." Officer Hawkins interrupted gently. "I understand you're going through a difficult time. Losing a spouse is incredibly traumatic, and it's not uncommon for grief to manifest in ways that feel suspicious. But what you're describing sounds like family members being concerned about your welfare, not criminal activity." Sarah pulled out the thumb drive, her hands shaking slightly. "I have evidence. Financial records showing my daughter stole over $200,000 from my husband's accounts. Documentation that she's been researching how to have me declared mentally incompetent." Officer Hawkins looked at the thumb drive without touching it. "Where did you obtain these alleged financial records?" "From my husband's computer. He hired a private investigator before he died because he suspected." "So, you accessed someone else's computer without permission and are now making accusations based on what you found?" The way he phrased it made her sound like a criminal rather than a victim. Sarah felt the familiar fog of confusion creeping back, not from medication this time, but from the systematic way her story was being dismantled. "It was my husband's computer in our house. But these financial records you mentioned, did you obtain them legally? Did you have authorization to access your daughter's private financial information?" Sarah stared at him, realizing too late how her evidence would sound to someone who wasn't living inside the nightmare Emma had constructed. Everything that felt like proof to her could be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a grieving widow on psychiatric medication. Officer Hawkins leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to recommend that you discuss these concerns with your doctor and your family. What you're describing sounds like it could be symptoms of the grief and anxiety you're already being treated for. Maybe your daughter could help you schedule a follow-up appointment." As if summoned by his suggestion, Sarah heard a familiar voice in the station's lobby, Emma talking to the desk sergeant with a perfect blend of concern and embarrassment that suggested she'd done this before. "She sometimes gets confused and makes accusations," Emma was saying in a voice just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "The grief has been so hard on her, and the medication makes her paranoid sometimes."
I'm so sorry she bothered you.
Officer Hawkins looked toward the lobby, then back at Sarah with an expression of confirmed suspicion. "Is that your daughter, Mrs. Williams?" Before Sarah could answer, Emma appeared in the doorway of the small interview room, her face a masterpiece of worried relief. "Mom, there you are. Mrs. Peterson called me when she saw you walking toward town. I was so worried." "How did you know I was here?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The desk sergeant called me when you started making allegations. They wanted to make sure someone was looking after you." Emma turned to Officer Hawkins with an apologetic smile.
I'm so sorry about this.
"She's been having episodes since my father died. The doctor says it's not uncommon with grief-related anxiety disorders." Episodes, allegations, anxiety disorders, each word carefully chosen to paint Sarah as an unreliable narrator of her own experience. "Mrs. Morrison," Officer Hawkins said, apparently already familiar with Emma's name. "Perhaps you should discuss with your mother's physician whether her current medication is appropriate. These kinds of paranoid thoughts can sometimes indicate the need for adjustment." "Oh, we have an appointment scheduled for later this week," Emma replied smoothly. "Dr. Reed has been so helpful in managing her care. He's mentioned that patients with her condition sometimes develop fixations on family members, especially regarding financial matters." Her condition, as if Sarah's suspicions were a medical diagnosis rather than a rational response to systematic manipulation. "I have evidence," Sarah said desperately, holding up the thumb drive. "Financial records, emails, a video my husband recorded before he died." "Mom," Emma interrupted gently. "You know you've been having trouble with technology lately. Remember when you thought someone had hacked your email account?" Dr. Reed explained that confusion about electronic devices is common with your type of anxiety. Officer Hawkins was nodding along, and Sarah realized with growing horror that this conversation had been choreographed. Emma had prepared for this moment, had already laid the groundwork to discredit anything Sarah might say or any evidence she might present. The ride home was silent, except for Emma's occasional sigh of disappointment. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar streets of Millbrook Heights, wondering how many of her neighbors had already been briefed on her declining mental state. How many concerned conversations had Emma had about her mother's paranoid delusions and need for more intensive care? At home, Emma guided her to the living room with the kind of gentle firmness used on psychiatric patients. "Mom, I think we need to call Michael. He should know about this episode." "It wasn't an episode," Sarah said, but her voice sounded weak even to herself. Emma was already dialing, and Sarah could hear Michael's voice on the other end of the line, concerned and distant from his home in Seattle. Emma's half of the conversation was perfectly crafted. Worried daughter trying to manage an increasingly unstable mother, reluctantly sharing details of paranoid accusations and concerning behavior. "She went to the police. Michael made wild claims about me stealing money and poisoning her. The officer was very kind, but you could see he was concerned about her mental state." Sarah couldn't hear Michael's response, but Emma's replies told the story. "Yes, the medications seemed to be making some things worse. No, she wasn't sure it was safe for their mother to live alone anymore. Dr. Reed had mentioned some excellent facilities that specialized in this kind of care." Facilities. The word landed in Sarah's chest like ice water. After Emma ended the call, she settled onto the couch beside Sarah with an expression of loving concern. "Michael's going to try to get some time off work to come visit. He's very worried about you, Mom. What did you tell him? The truth, Emma said simply. That you're struggling more than we realized. That the grief and medication are affecting your judgment. That we might need to consider more intensive support for your care. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Emma had systematically discredited her with the police, with her son, probably with Dr. Reed and the neighbors. Every institution and relationship that might have offered protection had been compromised by Emma's careful campaign of concerned daughter managing an increasingly incompetent mother. I want to change doctors, Sarah said suddenly. Get a second opinion. Emma's expression flickered for just a moment. Surprise, or perhaps annoyance, before the concern reasserted itself. Of course, Mom. If that would make you feel better, though Dr. Reed has been so helpful, and he knows your case so well. Starting over with someone new might be confusing for you right now. Even her request for medical independence was being reframed as another symptom of her condition. Sarah realized with dawning horror that Emma had constructed a perfect trap. Every attempt to assert her competence or challenge Emma's narrative would be interpreted as evidence of her declining mental state. The thumb drive sat heavy in her pocket, full of evidence that no one would believe came from a reliable source. James' video warning felt like a message from beyond the grave. But who would accept the word of a dead man as filtered through his allegedly delusional widow? That evening, as Emma prepared another elaborate meal in the kitchen, Sarah sat at the table and watched her daughter's efficient movements with new eyes. Every gesture was calculated. Every expression perfectly calibrated to support the image of a devoted daughter caring for a declining mother. I made your favorite, Emma said, setting down a plate of chicken marsala with the same perfect plating she'd been doing for days. You need to keep your strength up, especially with all the stress you've been under. The sauce looked rich and complex, probably delicious. It also probably contained whatever combination of substances had been clouding Sarah's mind for weeks. But refusing to eat would just provide more evidence of her deteriorating condition. Sarah took a small bite, tasting wine and herbs and something else she couldn't identify. Emma watched with satisfaction, making another mental note for her carefully maintained documentation of her mother's care. Dr. Reed called while you were resting, Emma said casually. He wants to schedule a more comprehensive evaluation next week. He's concerned that your current medication isn't managing your symptoms effectively. More comprehensive evaluation. Sarah's nursing background supplied the likely meaning: cognitive assessments, competency testing, the formal process of documenting mental decline for legal purposes. He mentioned some excellent residential facilities that specialize in your type of condition. Emma continued, places where you could get round-the-clock care from professionals who understand anxiety-related dementia. Anxiety-related dementia. Even Sarah's diagnosis was evolving to support Emma's ultimate goal. As Sarah chewed the carefully prepared meal that was probably poisoning her, she realized that Emma had won this round completely. The police saw her as a delusional elderly woman. Her son saw her as a declining mother who needed institutional care. Her doctor saw her as a patient whose condition was deteriorating beyond home management. But Sarah still had the thumb drive, still had James's warnings, still had enough of her nursing instincts to recognize what was happening to her. Emma might have won this battle, but the war for Sarah's sanity, her freedom, and her life was far from over. The question now was whether she could find anyone who would listen before Emma's carefully constructed timeline reached its inevitable conclusion. Detective Rosa Martinez had seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize the signs from 3 blocks away. The wellness check request had come through the standard channels. A concerned daughter worried about her recently widowed mother showing signs of mental deterioration, but something in the carefully worded report triggered her professional instincts. She'd been a cop for 15 years, the last 8 specializing in domestic abuse and elder exploitation. Her own mother had died in a nursing home after being systematically isolated and financially drained by a charming nephew who'd convinced everyone he was looking after her best interests. Rosa had learned to distrust perfect stories, especially when they involved vulnerable elderly people and suspiciously devoted family members. The Williams house sat pristine in the afternoon sunlight of Millbrook Heights, its manicured lawn and expensive landscaping suggesting financial stability that made stories of confused wandering seem oddly out of place. Rosa had done her homework before arriving. No history of domestic violence calls, no previous wellness checks, no pattern of concerning behavior, until very recently. Emma Williams Morrison answered the door with a kind of immediate, grateful relief that Rosa had learned to view with suspicion. Too perfect, too prepared, like an actress who'd rehearsed her lines. "Detective Martinez, thank God you came," Emma said, her voice carrying exactly the right blend of exhaustion and hope. "I've been so worried about Mom. She's been having increasingly severe episodes, and yesterday she went to the police, making wild accusations. I'm afraid she's becoming a danger to herself." Rosa made careful notes as Emma led her through the house, observing details that most people wouldn't notice. The home was spotless but felt staged, like a model home rather than a place where people actually lived. More importantly, she noticed that Emma consistently referred to her mother's behavior in clinical terms: episodes, deterioration, concerning symptoms, the language of someone building a medical case rather than expressing genuine worry. "Where is your mother now?" Rosa asked, resting upstairs. "The medication makes her very tired, but Dr. Reed says that's normal during the adjustment period." Emma's concern seemed genuine, but Rosa caught something else in her expression: calculation, as if she were weighing how much information to share. "I'd like to speak with her alone, if that's possible." Emma hesitated for just a moment. "Of course, though I should warn you that she's been very paranoid lately. She's convinced that I'm somehow poisoning her or stealing from her. The doctor says it's common with her type of anxiety disorder for patients to fixate on family members." Rosa had heard similar explanations before, usually from perpetrators who'd spent considerable time researching how to discredit their victims. "What type of anxiety disorder has she been diagnosed with?" "Grief-related anxiety with paranoid features," Emma replied smoothly. "Dr. Reed has been managing her care since Dad died. The combination of loss and her age has apparently triggered some underlying vulnerabilities." The medical terminology sounded rehearsed, and Rosa made another note as Emma led her upstairs. She'd learned to pay attention to how family members discuss their loved ones' conditions. Genuine concern usually involved more emotion and less clinical precision. Sarah Williams was sitting by her bedroom window, and Rosa's first impression contradicted everything Emma had told her. The woman who turned to face them didn't look confused or deteriorated. She looked tired, certainly, and weary, but her eyes were sharp with an intelligence that seemed at odds with the story of decline. "Mom, this is Detective Martinez," Emma said, her tone shifting to the careful patience used with mentally impaired patients. "She's here to check on you. Make sure you're feeling safe." Sarah's gaze moved between Emma and Rosa with an alertness that immediately raised red flags. Rosa had interviewed dozens of people with genuine cognitive decline, and they didn't usually display this kind of focused attention to social dynamics. "Could I speak with Mrs. Williams privately?" Rosa asked. "I don't think that's a good idea," Emma said quickly. "She gets agitated when she's alone with strangers, and her paranoid thoughts tend to escalate without someone familiar to ground her." "I'm fine talking alone," Sarah said quietly, and her voice carried none of the confusion Emma had described. If anything, she sounded like someone choosing her words very carefully. After Emma reluctantly left the room, Rosa settled into the chair across from Sarah and observed her more carefully. The woman sitting before her didn't match the profile of someone experiencing severe cognitive decline. Her posture was alert. Her eye contact was appropriate. Her responses were measured but coherent. "Mrs. Williams, your daughter is concerned about your welfare. Can you tell me how you've been feeling lately?" "Confused," Sarah admitted, "but not in the way Emma thinks. I've been confused about why my memory has been so unreliable, why I've been having symptoms that don't match my actual experience." Rosa leaned forward slightly. In her experience, people with genuine cognitive issues rarely had this kind of insight into their own condition. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah glanced toward the door, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a thumb drive. "My husband left evidence that Emma has been stealing money and researching how to have me declared incompetent. He recorded a video warning me about her before he died." The physical evidence surprised Rosa. Paranoid patients usually made vague accusations without concrete proof. "May I see this evidence?" As Sarah explained about James' investigation, the private investigator's findings, and Emma's financial desperation, Rosa found herself reassessing the entire situation. The story was complex, detailed, and internally consistent in a way that paranoid delusions typically weren't. "Mrs. Williams, you mentioned symptoms that don't match your experience. Can you be more specific?" "I've been a nurse for over 20 years, Sarah said. And suddenly her alert intelligence made more sense. "I know what grief looks like, what medication side effects feel like, what genuine confusion versus induced disorientation looks like. What I've been experiencing feels artificial, like something being done to me rather than happening naturally." Rosa made careful notes. Medical professionals, even retired ones, usually retained enough knowledge to recognize when their symptoms didn't fit standard patterns. "Have you shared these concerns with your doctor?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Dr. Reed seems more interested in Emma's observations than in my actual experience. Every appointment feels like a performance where Emma presents her documentation, and he adjusts my treatment based on her reports rather than his own assessment." That was another red flag. Rosa had seen cases where healthcare providers became unwitting accomplices to abuse by accepting family members' reports without sufficient independent evaluation of the patient. "I'd like to speak with someone else who's been observing your condition," Rosa said. "Someone outside the family dynamic." That afternoon, Rosa found herself at Millbrook Heights General Hospital, sitting across from Nurse Patricia Williams in the break room. Patricia had worked at the hospital for 35 years and had the kind of sharp, no-nonsense demeanor that came from decades of patient care. "I've been reviewing Mrs. Williams' case," Patricia said without preamble. "Something's not right about the documentation." Rosa pulled out her notebook. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Dr. Reed's notes describe a patient with severe cognitive decline, memory loss, disorientation. But when I've interacted with Sarah Williams, she's been alert, appropriate, asking intelligent questions about her medication and treatment plan." Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I've seen real dementia, detective. This isn't what it looks like." "What does it look like?" "Like someone being systematically drugged and gaslit." Patricia pulled out a medical file. "I've been tracking some patterns in Dr. Reed's recent cases. There are other elderly patients, usually recently widowed, who've shown similar rapid decline, followed by family members pushing for competency evaluations." The scope of what Patricia was suggesting made Rosa's stomach clench. How many other cases? At least 3 in the past year, all handled with the same efficiency, all resulting in families gaining power of attorney and patients being placed in long-term care facilities. Patricia's expression was grim. "I think we're looking at a pattern of medical fraud, and Sarah Williams might not be the only victim." As Rosa drove back toward the Williams house that evening, her mind raced through the implications. If Patricia was right, they weren't dealing with an isolated case of family manipulation, but a systematic scheme involving medical professionals and potentially multiple victims. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma Williams Morrison. "Mom had another episode this afternoon. Very agitated after your visit. Dr. Reed wants to schedule an emergency evaluation tomorrow." The timing felt suspicious. Rosa had seen this pattern before. Victims' conditions mysteriously deteriorated whenever outside authorities became involved, usually because perpetrators escalated their tactics when they felt threatened. Rosa pulled over and called Sarah's cell phone directly. When Sarah answered, her voice was clearer than it had been during the day. "Mrs. Williams, this is Detective Martinez. How are you feeling right now?" "Better than I have in weeks," Sarah said quietly. "I stopped taking the medication Emma's been giving me. My head is clearing up." "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Do you feel safe in your house tonight?" There was a long pause. "No," Sarah said finally. "I don't think I do." Rosa made a decision that would either advance the case or end her career. "I'm coming back. Don't eat or drink anything Emma gives you, and if possible, try to record any conversations you have with her about your medical care." As she turned the car around, Rosa thought about her own mother, alone and vulnerable in those final months. While everyone around her praised the nephew who was systematically destroying her, she hadn't been able to save her mother. But maybe she could save Sarah Williams. The difference was that this time she knew what to look for, and she had an ally in Patricia Williams, someone with the medical knowledge to expose whatever Dr. Reed was doing to facilitate this abuse. The war for Sarah Williams' freedom was about to begin in earnest. And for the first time since James's death, Sarah wouldn't be fighting alone. David Morrison's call came at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday, catching Sarah in the kitchen while Emma was upstairs getting dressed. His voice on the phone carried the particular edge of someone who'd been wrestling with a difficult decision. "Mrs. Williams, this is David Morrison, Emma's ex-husband." The pause before ex-husband suggested the divorce wounds were still fresh. "I heard through some mutual friends that you've been having some health issues, and I wanted to check on you." Sarah gripped the phone tighter, glancing toward the stairs. Emma's shower was still running, but she needed to be careful. "That's very kind of you, David."
I'm managing.
"Are you?" His question was sharper than casual concern. "Because what I'm hearing doesn't sound like the Sarah Williams the first remember, the sharp, competent woman who used to give Emma hell for her financial irresponsibility." The reference to Emma's financial problems made Sarah's heart race. "David, Mrs. Williams, I know this is going to sound strange, but I think Emma is doing to you what she tried to do to my mother during our divorce." His voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "I think she's playing the same game she perfected on me for 3 years." Sarah's hands began trembling. Someone else who understood, someone who'd seen Emma's true nature. What kind of game? The systematic destruction of someone's credibility while positioning herself as the caring, responsible party. She's very, very good at it. David's bitterness was palpable. "May I ask, have you been having memory problems? Confusion episodes where you can't remember things that happened recently?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, barely breathing the word. "And Emma has been documenting everything, hasn't she? Keeping careful records of your symptoms, managing your medications, speaking for you at medical appointments." Each question felt like David was reading directly from Emma's playbook. "How did you know?" "Because she did the exact same thing to my 78-year-old mother when we were going through the divorce proceedings. She convinced everyone that Mom was developing dementia, that she needed Emma's help managing her finances and medical care." David's voice carried a fury that had been building for months. "By the time I realized what was happening, Emma had gained power of attorney over my mother's assets and was systematically draining her accounts." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Your mother, is she?" "She's fine now, living in assisted care that she actually needs and enjoys, with her finances restored and her dignity intact. But it took 6 months of legal battles and a team of lawyers to expose what Emma had done." David's voice softened slightly. "Mrs. Williams, how much do you know about Emma's current financial situation?" "I know she's been having problems since the divorce." "Problems?" David laughed bitterly. "She owes over $200,000 to creditors, some of whom don't take kindly to late payments. She gambled away most of her settlement money within weeks of our divorce being finalized, and she's been scrambling ever since to find a new source of income." Sarah thought about James' investigation, the private investigator's reports hidden on the thumb drive upstairs. "David, did you know that James hired someone to look into Emma's finances before he died?" The silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, David spoke, his voice tight with what sounded like fear. "Mrs. Williams, I think we need to meet in person, and I think we need to do it without Emma knowing." 2 hours later, Sarah sat in a coffee shop 20 minutes outside Millbrook Heights, waiting for a man she hadn't seen since Emma's wedding 3 years ago. She told Emma she was going to the library, a lie that felt both necessary and terrifying. The fact that she was lying to her own daughter about her activities seemed like evidence of how far their relationship had deteriorated. David arrived precisely on time, looking older than Sarah remembered, but carrying himself with the careful confidence of someone who'd survived a war. He slid into the booth across from her, immediately scanning the restaurant as if checking for familiar faces. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Sarah admitted. Part of me still can't believe we're having this conversation about Emma. David pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I brought copies of everything I gathered during our legal battles. Financial records, medical reports, testimony from witnesses who saw what she was doing to my mother. He leaned forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Williams, Emma is not the person you raised. I don't know when she changed or what changed her, but the woman I married was capable of destroying anyone who stood between her and what she wanted. Sarah stared at the folder. What exactly did she do to your mother? Started with small things. Expressing concern about Mom's memory, her ability to manage her medications safely. Sound familiar? David's smile was bitter. Then Emma began volunteering to help, managing appointments, organizing pills, keeping track of symptoms. Before long, she was the primary interface between my mother and her medical care. The parallels to Sarah's own situation were chilling, and the doctors believed her. Emma is exceptionally convincing. She presents as the perfect, devoted daughter-in-law, armed with detailed documentation of concerning behaviors. Medical professionals tend to trust family members who seem so involved in caring. David opened the folder, revealing pages of medical records. It took months for anyone to question whether the symptoms Emma was reporting actually matched what they were observing directly. Sarah studied the documents, seeing her own future reflected in the careful medical notes. How did you finally expose her? I started recording conversations, David said. Emma got careless when she thought she was winning, and I caught her instructing a nurse about symptoms to watch for that my mother had never actually displayed. That recording, combined with financial forensics showing the money trail, was enough to get the courts to intervene. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the audio files. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to play something for you. I recorded this during a meeting Emma had with my mother's doctor 6 months ago. The audio quality was poor, but Emma's voice was unmistakable. She's been having more episodes of confusion lately, doctor. Yesterday, she asked me 3 times who I was, and this morning I found her standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., completely disoriented. I'm worried she's becoming a danger to herself. Sarah's blood ran cold. The words were almost identical to things Emma had said about her to Dr. Reed. The problem was, David continued, my mother was in the hospital that entire week for a planned procedure. She couldn't have been having episodes at home because she wasn't at home. Emma was so focused on building her narrative that she forgot to check her facts. She's been saying similar things about me, Sarah whispered. To my doctor, to the police, to my son. David nodded grimly. The pattern is always the same. Create symptoms through medication interactions or psychological manipulation. Document the symptoms meticulously. Then use the documentation to justify increased control over the victim's life and finances. He pulled out another set of documents. These are Emma's financial records from the past year. Credit card statements, bank records, loan applications. She's desperate, Mrs. Williams. Desperate people do desperate things. Sarah studied the papers, seeing the same information James' investigator had gathered. Mounting debts, failed attempts to secure loans, increasing desperation evident in every financial decision. There's something else, David said quietly. Something I've been afraid to tell anyone because it sounds so paranoid. But I think Emma may have been researching ways to accelerate natural death in elderly patients. I found internet searches on her computer about drug interactions, dosage calculations, symptoms that could be mistaken for natural decline. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too small. Sarah thought about all the carefully prepared meals Emma had been making. The way she insisted on managing every aspect of Sarah's medication, the elaborate care that felt more like control with each passing day. David, my husband, died of a heart attack just when he was about to confront Emma about the money she'd stolen. The timing was convenient. David's expression went very still. Mrs. Williams, are you suggesting? I don't know what I'm suggesting, Sarah said quickly. But James was healthy. His last physical was clean, and then suddenly he's dead. Right when Emma needed him out of the way. They sat in silence, both contemplating implications too horrible to voice directly. Finally, David spoke. I have contacts in the legal system from my own battle with Emma, lawyers who specialize in elder abuse, investigators who understand financial fraud. He pulled out a business card. But more importantly, I'm willing to testify about what she did to my mother. The methods she used, the pattern of behavior, the systematic way she destroys her victims' credibility. Sarah took the card with shaking hands. Why are you doing this? You could just walk away. Be glad you're free of her. Because I know what it feels like to watch someone you love being systematically destroyed while everyone around them praises their abuser. David's voice was heavy with regret. I couldn't protect my mother fast enough. Maybe I can help protect you. As Sarah drove home, David's folder of evidence on the passenger seat beside her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just the desperate hope of a trapped victim, but the strategic hope of someone building a case, gathering allies, preparing for battle. Emma was good at her game, perhaps even brilliant at it. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd played it before with witnesses who survived to tell the story. The war for Sarah's life was about to become very public, and for the first time since James' death, Sarah believed she might actually win. Sarah woke to the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The bedroom ceiling swam above her in dizzy spirals, and her mouth felt stuffed with cotton. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like they were moving through thick water. Something was very, very wrong. The bedside clock read 11:47 p.m., though she couldn't remember going to bed. The last clear memory she had was finishing dinner. Emma's special chicken piccata that she'd insisted Sarah eat every bite of. You need your strength, Mom. Dr. Reed was very specific about maintaining proper nutrition with your medications. Medications. Sarah's nursing instincts fought through the chemical fog clouding her brain. She'd stopped taking the lorazepam days ago, but this felt like more than anxiety medication. This felt like a sedative overdose. She managed to roll onto her side, and that's when she saw Emma standing in the doorway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. Her daughter's face was illuminated by the hallway light, and her expression wasn't one of concern. It was calculating, watching, waiting. Emma. Sarah's voice came out slurred, barely recognizable as her own. Sure, Mom. It's okay. You're having another episode. Emma moved into the room with quiet efficiency, and Sarah noticed she was carrying her phone. I'm calling 911. You tried to hurt yourself again. The words hit Sarah like ice water, cutting through some of the chemical haze. I didn't. What? You took too many pills, Mom. I found you unconscious in the bathroom with an empty bottle of lorazepam beside you. Emma's voice carried the perfect blend of fear and resignation, the tone of a daughter who'd been expecting this moment. I should have seen the signs. You've been so depressed lately, talking about wanting to join Dad. Sarah tried to protest, to explain that she hadn't taken any pills, hadn't been in the bathroom, had never expressed suicidal thoughts, but her tongue felt thick and unresponsive, and Emma was already speaking to the 911 operator. Yes, this is Emma Williams Morrison. My mother, Sarah Williams, attempted suicide by overdose. She's conscious but barely responsive. We need an ambulance immediately. Emma provided their address with calm precision, then added the detail that would shape everything that followed. She's been under psychiatric care for depression and anxiety following my father's death. Dr. Marcus Reed at Millbrook Family Practice has been managing her medications. As Emma spoke, Sarah tried to remember taking any pills. Tried to recall being in the bathroom, but the memories weren't there. And the harder she tried to think, the more the chemical fog seemed to thicken around her thoughts. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, their questions focused and urgent. Sarah tried to tell them she hadn't taken any overdose, that something else was wrong, but her words came out garbled and incoherent. The lead paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, spoke to her with the gentle patience reserved for psychiatric patients. Mrs. Williams, can you tell me how many pills you took tonight? Didn't take. Sarah struggled with each word. Didn't take any pills. The paramedic exchanged glances with Emma, who stepped forward with helpful concern. She's been having episodes of confusion and memory loss, Emma explained. Her doctor recently adjusted her psychiatric medications because she was having paranoid thoughts. She may not remember taking the pills. The confusion has been getting worse. Sarah wanted to scream that Emma was lying, that she'd been drugged without her knowledge, that this was all part of the systematic manipulation David had warned her about. But the words wouldn't come, and her apparent inability to form coherent sentences only supported Emma's narrative of a confused, suicidal woman. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Sarah caught a glimpse of Emma's face in the flashing emergency lights. For just a moment, her daughter's carefully constructed mask of concern slipped, revealing something cold and satisfied beneath. The emergency room at Millbrook Heights General was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as they pumped her stomach, started for fluids, and ran blood tests to determine exactly what and how much she'd ingested. Dr. Jennifer Park, the attending physician, spoke with Emma in the hallway just outside Sarah's cubicle. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation through the thin curtain. Blood levels indicate a significant overdose of lorazepam, possibly combined with other sedatives. She's been so depressed since my father died, talking about not wanting to live without him. Dr. Reed has been managing her psychiatric care, but she's been resistant to treatment. Mention facilities that might be better equipped to handle her level of care. Even in her drugged state, Sarah understood the implications. Emma was using this manufactured crisis to justify immediate psychiatric commitment. But then, a familiar voice cut through the medical discussion. Nurse Patricia Williams arrived for her night shift and recognized the situation immediately. Dr. Park, I'd like to review this case, if you don't mind. I've been following Mrs. Williams' care, and something doesn't feel right about the presentation. Sarah felt a surge of hope as Patricia approached her bedside. Unlike the other medical staff, Patricia didn't speak to her with the careful patience reserved for psychiatric patients. Instead, she looked directly into Sarah's eyes with professional assessment. Sarah, I know you can't speak clearly right now because of whatever you've been given, but I need you to listen to me carefully. Blink once for yes, twice for no. Did you intentionally take an overdose tonight? Sarah blinked twice emphatically. Patricia made a note, then asked, Do you believe you were given these medications without your knowledge? One blink. Yes. Has your daughter been controlling your food and medications? One blink accompanied by tears of relief that someone finally understood. Patricia's expression hardened with professional anger. She'd seen this pattern before, and she knew what she was looking at. Dr. Park, I'd like to request a hold on any psychiatric commitments until we can get some additional testing done. This presentation is inconsistent with voluntary overdose. From the hallway, Emma's voice rose slightly, in what sounded like panic. I don't understand. She clearly took too many pills. I found her unconscious, with the empty bottle. Where is this bottle? Patricia asked, stepping into the hallway. Emma's hesitation was brief, but telling. I threw it away. I was so panicked I just grabbed it and threw it in the kitchen trash. Which has presumably been collected by now, Patricia observed dryly. How convenient. That's when Detective Rosa Martinez arrived, having been alerted by Patricia's call. Sarah had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life. I came as soon as I heard, Rosa announced, her presence immediately changing the dynamic in the small emergency department. How is Mrs. Williams? Dr. Park began explaining the overdose situation, but Rosa interrupted with questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Who found Mrs. Williams? What time? Were there witnesses? Has anyone been able to verify her mental state before the alleged overdose? Emma's answers became more defensive with each question. Yes, she'd been the only one home. No, there hadn't been any witnesses to Sarah's alleged distress. No, she hadn't thought to call anyone else for help before calling 911. Detective Martinez, Emma said with strained patience, My mother has been having severe psychiatric problems since my father died. Dr. Reed can confirm that she's been paranoid, delusional, making wild accusations about family members. This suicide attempt is unfortunately consistent with her deteriorating mental state. But Rosa had been preparing for this moment since her conversation with Patricia the previous day. Ms. Morrison, I've been investigating some concerns about your mother's care. I'm going to need to speak with her privately once the medical staff clears her for conversation. She's not competent to give reliable statements, Emma protested. Her psychiatric condition makes her an unreliable witness to her own experience. That will be for me to determine, Rosa said firmly. As the hours passed and the sedatives gradually cleared from Sarah's system, she became more alert and coherent. Patricia had ordered additional blood tests beyond the standard toxicology screen, looking for substances that wouldn't normally be tested for in a suicide attempt. By dawn, Sarah was sitting up in bed, her speech clear and her mind sharp for the first time in weeks. The contrast was dramatic enough that even Dr. Park began questioning the narrative Emma had provided. Mrs. Williams, Rosa said, settling into the chair beside Sarah's hospital bed. I need you to tell me exactly what you remember from last night. Sarah recounted the dinner, the elaborate meal Emma had insisted she finished completely, the way her daughter had watched her eat with unusual intensity. She described waking up disoriented and finding Emma fully dressed and ready with a story about suicide attempts and empty pill bottles. I never took any overdose, Sarah said clearly. I haven't been taking the anxiety medication Emma thought I was taking. I've been palming the pills for days. Someone drugged me deliberately. Emma, overhearing from the hallway, stepped into the room with an expression of hurt confusion. Mom, you're having another paranoid episode. Dr. Reed warned this might happen, that you might create elaborate explanations for your own self-destructive behavior. But Rosa was ready with questions that Emma couldn't have prepared for. Ms. Morrison, can you explain why your mother's blood tests show she had 3 different sedatives in her system, but only one of them was the medication prescribed by Dr. Reed? Emma's face went pale. I don't know. Maybe she took other things. Maybe she had old medications she'd been hoarding. The other substances aren't typically prescribed for anxiety or depression, Patricia interjected, reviewing the lab results. One is a sleep aid that's usually reserved for severe insomnia, and the other is an antipsychotic that would never be prescribed to someone with your mother's supposed condition. Rosa pulled out her phone and played an audio recording. Miss Morrison, I'd like you to listen to this conversation recorded yesterday by your ex-husband, David Morrison. Emma's own voice filled the hospital room, caught in conversation with someone about the best combinations of medications to cause confusion and memory loss in elderly patients. Her face went from pale to ash gray as she realized the trap that had been laid for her. You can't use that, Emma said desperately. David is vindictive. He's trying to get revenge for our divorce. Actually, Rosa said, pulling out a warrant, I can use it to justify searching your personal effects, your computer, and your home for evidence of what you've been doing to your mother. As hospital security restrained Emma, who had begun screaming about conspiracy and persecution, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the solid ground of truth beneath her feet. The fog was lifting, both literally and figuratively. The systematic destruction of her credibility, the careful manipulation of her medical care, the elaborate staging of her decline, all of it was finally being exposed by people who'd recognized the pattern and refused to be fooled by Emma's carefully constructed lies. Dr. Reed, arriving for what he'd expected to be Sarah's psychiatric commitment evaluation, found instead a clear-headed patient surrounded by law enforcement and facing questions about his role in enabling Emma's abuse. The nightmare was far from over, but for the first time since James' death, Sarah believed it might actually end. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. Sarah's hands shook as she signed the final medical discharge paperwork 3 days later. But the tremor came from relief rather than residual medication effects. For the first time in months, her signature looked like her own. Steady, confident, belonging to a woman who knew her own mind. Dr. Reed had been conspicuously absent from her care since the night of Emma's arrest. The new attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, had reviewed Sarah's case with the fresh eyes of someone not invested in the previous narrative. The contrast was striking. Your cognitive assessments are all within normal ranges for someone your age, Dr. Chen explained as Sarah prepared to leave. Whatever confusion you experienced appears to have been chemically induced. The combination of substances in your system that night would have caused severe disorientation in anyone. Detective Martinez waited in the hospital lobby, holding a manila folder thick with evidence. Over the past 3 days, the scope of Emma's manipulation had become staggeringly clear. Search warrants executed on Emma's belongings had revealed a cache of prescription medications acquired through various means, detailed research on elder abuse tactics, and financial records showing her desperate attempts to access James's estate. "We found something else," Rosa said as they walked toward her car. Emma had been researching her husband's medical history, specifically looking into ways to induce heart attacks in people with no previous cardiac symptoms. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "You think she killed James?" "The medical examiner is reopening the investigation based on what we found. Emma had access to medications that can cause cardiac arrest when administered in the right combinations, and the timeline of your husband's death was extremely convenient for her financial situation." Sarah stared out the car window at the familiar streets of Millbrook Heights. Everything looked the same, but she felt like she was seeing her neighborhood through new eyes, not as a safe suburban haven, but as a place where her daughter had systematically planned to destroy her life. Where is Emma now? County jail, held without bail. The charges are extensive: elder abuse, financial fraud, assault with intent to cause bodily harm, forgery. The district attorney is considering additional charges related to your husband's death pending the autopsy results. They drove in silence for several minutes before Rosa continued. "Your son Michael is flying in this afternoon. I spoke with him yesterday to explain the situation. He's struggling with the reality of what his sister was doing." Sarah's heart clenched. Michael had believed Emma's stories about her declining mental health and had been prepared to support his sister's efforts to have her committed. Now, he would have to reconcile that with the truth about Emma's manipulation. The house looked exactly as Sarah had left it 4 days earlier, but walking through the front door felt like entering a crime scene. Every carefully prepared meal, every concerned suggestion about her medication, every loving gesture of care had been revealed as calculated steps in a plan to steal her life. Patricia Williams from the hospital had volunteered to stay with Sarah for the first few days, both for practical support and as a professional witness to her recovery. The contrast was immediate. Patricia treated Sarah as a competent adult, asked her preferences about meals and activities, and respected her ability to manage her own medications. "It's remarkable how quickly you're recovering now that you're not being systematically poisoned," Patricia observed as Sarah prepared her own lunch for the first time in weeks. "Your cognitive function, your physical coordination, even your emotional stability, everything's returning to baseline." That afternoon, Michael arrived looking haggard and guilt-ridden. At 32, he'd inherited James' analytical mind and Sarah's stubborn streak. But Emma's manipulation had exploited his greatest weakness, his tendency to trust family members without question. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said before he'd even fully entered the house. "I believed everything Emma told me. I was ready to support having you committed. I failed you completely." Sarah felt her heart break for her son's pain. "You couldn't have known." Emma was very convincing. "I should have known," Michael insisted. "I should have visited more, paid attention, trusted my own observations instead of just accepting Emma's reports. Dad always said Emma was manipulative, but I thought he was just being overprotective." They spent hours going through the evidence Detective Martinez had shared: the financial records showing Emma's theft, the research into medication interactions, the systematic documentation of symptoms that had been artificially induced. Michael's expression grew darker with each revelation. "She was going to kill you," he said finally. "If this had gone on much longer, between the medications and the stress and the isolation, she would have killed you." That evening, David Morrison arrived to check on Sarah and to provide additional support for the legal proceedings ahead. His experience fighting Emma's manipulation of his own mother had given him insights into her tactics that would be crucial for building the criminal case. "The pattern is always the same," David explained as they sat around Sarah's kitchen table, the same table where Emma had served her carefully poisoned meals. "She isolates the victim, controls their access to information and support, then systematically destroys their credibility while positioning herself as the caring, responsible family member." Patricia nodded grimly. "We found similar patterns in Dr. Reed's other cases. At least 3 other families where elderly patients showed rapid decline, followed by family members gaining power of attorney. The medical board is investigating his entire practice." "What about the other victims?" Sarah asked. Margaret Chen's family is reopening her case. Thomas Rodriguez's son is working with investigators to review his father's death. If we can prove a pattern of systematic abuse, the criminal charges could be much more severe. Over the next few days, Sarah began the long process of reclaiming her life. She changed all her passwords, reviewed her financial accounts, and consulted with an attorney about protecting her assets. The house that had felt like a prison began to feel like home again as she cleaned out Emma's belongings and reclaimed her own space. But the most difficult task was emotional. Sarah had to reconcile her memories of raising Emma, the loving daughter, the bright child full of potential, with the calculating predator who had been willing to destroy her own mother for financial gain. Michael helped her go through James' study, organizing the evidence he'd been gathering before his death. They found love letters James had written but never sent, describing his growing fears about Emma and his desperate attempts to protect Sarah from what he saw coming. He knew, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she read her husband's final warnings. He knew exactly what Emma was planning, and he died trying to protect me from it. The preliminary autopsy results arrived the following week. James' death had indeed been caused by a combination of substances that could induce cardiac arrest in healthy individuals. Emma's murder charges were upgraded to include his death. As Sarah stood in the courthouse for Emma's arraignment, watching her daughter in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, she felt a complex mixture of grief, relief, and something that might have been closure. This was not the daughter she had raised, but it was the person Emma had chosen to become. Emma's eyes met hers across the courtroom, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flash of the old Emma, the daughter who had once needed bedtime stories and help with homework. But that person was gone, if she had ever really existed at all. The judge set Emma's trial date for 6 months in the future. Sarah would have to testify, would have to recount publicly how her own daughter had systematically tried to destroy her mind and steal her life. But she would survive to tell that story. And that was more than Emma had planned to allow. Walking out of the courthouse with Michael and Detective Martinez, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in almost a year: hope for the future. The nightmare was ending, and she was still standing. 6 months later, Sarah Williams stood at the podium in the Millbrook Heights Community Center, looking out at an audience of healthcare professionals, legal advocates, and family members who had learned too late about the signs of elder abuse. Her voice was steady as she began the presentation that had become her mission. My name is Sarah Williams, and 8 months ago, my own daughter tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could steal my inheritance. She nearly succeeded. The room was silent, except for the soft clicking of pens as people took notes. These monthly workshops had grown from a small support group into a regional training program that hospitals and law enforcement agencies were beginning to require for their staff. The most insidious thing about medical gaslighting, Sarah continued, is that it exploits our trust in the very systems meant to protect us. When family members and healthcare providers work together, knowingly or unknowingly, to undermine a patient's credibility, the victim has nowhere to turn. In the front row, Detective Rosa Martinez nodded approvingly. She'd helped Sarah develop this presentation, and their unlikely partnership had become a model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar cases. Rosa now specialized in training law enforcement to recognize the subtle signs of systematic elder abuse. Today, I want to introduce you to someone whose courage saved my life and exposed a pattern of abuse that had been operating in our community for years. Sarah gestured toward the side of the room. Nurse Patricia Williams recognized what others had missed and chose to act on her professional instincts rather than accept the narrative she was being told. Patricia stepped forward, her 35 years of nursing experience evident in her no-nonsense demeanor. Healthcare providers must understand that our obligation is to our patients, not to the family members who speak for them. When documentation doesn't match observation, when symptoms don't align with presentation, we have a duty to investigate rather than simply accept explanations. The presentation continued with case studies. Margaret Chen's family had discovered evidence of systematic financial abuse before her death, leading to additional charges against Dr. Reed and his associates. Thomas Rodriguez's death was being reinvestigated based on the patterns they'd uncovered. The scope of the conspiracy had ultimately involved 12 elderly victims and 4 healthcare providers. After the workshop, Sarah and Michael walked through the hospital corridors where she'd once fought for her sanity and her life. The medical center had implemented new protocols based on their case: mandatory independent cognitive assessments for patients whose families sought competency evaluations, requirements for multiple healthcare providers to observe and document patient interactions, and training programs to help staff recognize the signs of medical manipulation. "Mom," Michael said as they reached the parking garage, "Dad would be proud of what you've built from this nightmare." Sarah smiled, thinking of James' video warning and his desperate attempts to protect her. "I think he'd be glad to know his investigation finally served its purpose, just not the way either of us expected." That evening, Sarah sat in James' study, now her advocacy center, reviewing applications for the James Williams Foundation, which provided legal support and investigative services for families dealing with elder abuse. The irony wasn't lost on her that Emma's greed had ultimately created a legacy that would help protect other vulnerable people. Emma's trial had ended with conviction on all charges: financial fraud, elder abuse, and 2 counts of murder in the first degree for both James's death and Margaret Chen's death from the stress of her systematic abuse. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, and Sarah had found an unexpected peace in that certainty. The phone rang as Sarah finished reviewing the latest case files. Detective Martinez's voice carried excitement. "Sarah, I wanted to let you know we just got word that the Connecticut Attorney General's office wants to use your case as the foundation for new elder abuse legislation. They're calling it the Sarah Williams Protection Act." As Sarah hung up the phone and looked around the study filled with James' memory and her new purpose, she realized that healing didn't mean forgetting the trauma. It meant transforming the pain into something that could protect others from similar suffering. Outside her window, the lights of Millbrook Heights twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere in those houses were other vulnerable people, other families dealing with the complicated dynamics of aging, care, and trust. But now there were systems in place to help them, protocols to protect them, and people who understood that the greatest predators often wear the masks of those who claim to love us most. Sarah Williams had survived, and in surviving, she'd ensured that others would have a better chance of surviving, too. That was legacy enough. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.